Welcome on. Welcome all to the Politics of Cinema. On this show, we believe films are never neutral. There's a political as well as artistic message captured, sometimes on purpose, sometimes on accident, in every film, and we are on the lookout for all of it. My name is Aaron Spears.
And I'm Isaac Miller. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about Chloé Zhao's award-winning Nomadland and political film criticism. Yes, we are putting the entire credibility of this entire podcast, all of our efforts and dreams and hopes on the line in this episode. This is going to be riveting.
It is. I think it will be as well. Well, it's the premise for the show. Again, it goes right back to, not again, but like we do kind of reference Children of Men, which was our very first episode for a reason. We chose that for a reason. And how when you do have overtly political films or political messaging in films, how sometimes that can get missed or misinterpreted, I think is more often the case from film critics that may or may not be as, politically educated as they are film educated.
But I think, in some ways, this episode we're talking about, or what we're maybe even debating, is the other way around, is to what degree is purely sort of ideological readings of films useful.
Right.
And, which of course, that's a lot of what we do, is take movies that are not overtly political and point out all their political elements.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the things is we don't tend to do that in a way that says the movie is good or bad quality-wise, even if maybe we might say that the film is reprehensible.
Well, we've mentioned that with certain films, Empire Records, Gung Ho, sort of stuff like that. But for the most part, we've eschewed since the birth of the show, and I think for the life of the show, thumbs up, thumbs down, or like, should you watch it or not? Like even terrible films are worth, a look depending on how you're looking at the film. Yeah, it's a terribly made film, but oh man, this has got some really interesting politics to it.
Right. Exactly. And those are different things. I think we always talk about the quality of it. So I think, part of it is, in the case of Nomadland, it dusted up a controversy. It dusted up a controversy which was noticeable. And I think, part of it is, this is not something that would have been true a few years ago, but we live in a much more political age, and an age in which in a broad left framework, movies are judged and Hollywood is judged much more strenuously. Part of it has to do with the internet, and internet sphere and all sorts of things. And so, part of it is that this movie came under criticism for its portrayal specifically of Amazon, and then more broadly as sort of an image of American poverty, because it's being touted as such, right? As something that is a mirror for ourselves to look back at. And it's interesting. I think there's a certain type of knee-jerk left film criticism that neither of us like. I think I usually jokingly call it the Jacobin school, which actually reviews in Jacobin magazine are actually not all that bad, but for a long time, consistently they were shit. I think they've gotten better.
Really?
I think they've gotten better. I think the one for Nomadland is considerably better than what it used to be.
Oh no, I read Eileen Jones pretty regularly because, well, also I get the magazine. But I haven't for years and years and years. So I'm a little bit newer to their film criticism, like in the last 2 or 3 years, I would say.
My example, and I sort of stopped reading it, so like I think they did get better. I think this is a good example, but there is an incredible review of Mad Max Fury Road, which not only gets basic facts of the movie wrong, but it's just dumb.
Oh,
it's just a desperate attempt to over-intellectualize it. And it is sort of, I mean, I think what we're talking about is sort of treating a piece of art or film as if it should be, as if there's something wrong with it if it's not basically a manifesto. Now, there's a lot of political movies that are functionally manifestos, and a lot of them are really good. There's also a lot of political movies which are functionally manifestos, and they're not very good. It's not an easy thing to do.
Right. You mean the not good example would be like all of Dinesh D'Souza's filmography?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely like ham-fisted like left movies in that regard as well.
Right. Well, I mean, see what we just went through, the Workers on Films selection of episodes throughout the month of May. And there were several examples in there where we were like, oh, this is like fantastic leftist propaganda because it's, also a great movie.
Right. Right. I mean, I don't know. We were chatting earlier about Battle of Algiers, a movie like Burn, all of that.
Yeah.
Like these are these are literal manifesto movies, but they're
Right.
made by like the greatest filmmakers ever.
Well, speaking of manifesto movies, then do you consider Nomadland to be a manifesto movie?
No.
I don't either. But it seemed like some of the left criticism was like, "Oh, it got all this wrong. Like it's not a good manifesto movie." I'm like, well, yeah, but
Well,
it's not trying to be.
it's not trying to be. But I don't disagree with all the criticisms, and I think that there's a complicated question to be had here.
There is,
And
there is.
and you do disagree with all the criticism. So let's start with your perspective on this, and sort of point to your key examples of this of crappy versions of this.
Well, just as a very quick preface before we do that, in case anyone isn't familiar with Nomadland, this is Chloe Zhao's 2020, like you said, award-winning film. Stars Frances McDormand as a woman in her 60s who, after losing everything in the Great Recession, including her husband, literally her town, her job, her livelihood, embarks on a journey through the American West, living as a van-dwelling modern-day nomad. That is the quick synopsis from IMDb, and unlike most films we're talking about, actually is a pretty succinct and accurate, one-line description of this particular movie.
You are one of those lucky people that can travel anywhere.
Yes, ma'am, I know.
And they sometimes call you nomads.
My mom says that you're homeless. Is that true?
No, I'm not homeless. I'm just houseless. Not the same thing, right?
No.
My husband worked at the USG mine in Empire. I was a substitute teacher.
It is a tough time right now. You may want to consider early retirement.
I need work. I like work.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Welcome to Badlands Spa.
What the nomads are doing is not that different than what the pioneers did.
Gotta make the hole bigger.
I think Fern's part of an American tradition.
Oh, he's gonna come right through the glass. My dad used to say, what's remembered lives. I maybe spent too much of my life just remembering.
So right from the start, I want to say, Frances McDormand is a fucking national treasure and is amazing in this, and I think justifiably got all the awards that she deserves for this one. But also, Chloé Zhao, as two former employees at an art house theater that has played Chloé Zhao's film, two other feature films. I was very much looking forward to this one. Unfortunately, it came out during, the pandemic and all that. So I had to watch it on my home cinema screen. This would have been gorgeous on the big screen.
I know. Oh my gosh.
She
is such an eye. It's just.
Well, and shout out to her longtime cinematographer. And I think partner. I don't think they're married, but I know they've been dating for quite a while. Cinematographer Joshua James Richards, who they met in film school, if I have that correctly. I don't remember what film school they went to, but also Chloé Zhao is an editor. She edited this one as well. So like it was clearly, and also reading the production, like this was a passion project. They are invested in this. This is not some studio assignment. This is not. I mean, now she's doing Marvel. That's a whole separate topic. We'll record that once the Immortals comes out, I'm sure. We're gonna get some opinions on that. But Eternals. Sorry. Yeah, Eternals. That's your wheelhouse, not mine. So, but what we saw. So this movie, I think, has two tracks going for it. One, there were leftist criticisms and critiques, and even critiques from the right. Looking at you, Armond White. We'll get to you in a second. From about the film and the content. But there's also a separate thing that I do want to keep in mind. I don't know how much we want to get into in this episode of once not you, you're a film, you're not a person. Once a film becomes an Oscar or an awards, Oscar is like the award. So we'll just say the Oscar, the Oscar frontrunner, which this movie, did win. Once it becomes an Oscar frontrunner, usually there's like an ebb and flow to the contrarian opinion pieces that start coming out. Why is this the front runner? Oh, you're missing this one. Oh, you're missing that one. Or like, once you get that spotlight on you as an awards front runner, the contrarians start coming out of the closet, come out of the woodwork, and start attacking the front runner.
Right.
I mean, you've noticed that trend too, right?
Absolutely. And I think, a lot of the worst stuff wasn't so much written reviews, but stuff you saw on Twitter in terms of just sort of like stuff where it was very clear that nobody, it's a big Hollywood thing. This is a Disney production. And it's like, like people who had never seen any of Chloe Zhao's other movies or understood who she is as a filmmaker,
Right.
So that was sort of the first line of these sort of critiques. And I think those are pretty dismissible because it shows like a complete misunderstanding of like, how does the industry work? No, this is not a Disney movie, like it's not, this is a small movie.
Right. I mean, she like the definition of independent filmmaker.
Right.
However, due to like mergers and acquisition, however the fuck all that worked, technically this did have financing from a studio, unlike Songs My Brother Taught Me in 2015 or The Rider in 2017.
So she's finally gotten to the stage of actually having financing from a studio. This is not.
Well, actually, since we mentioned that, there's a quick quote here we can throw in because it's totally relevant here from Chloé. She said, it was a mix. So Nomadland was her first studio production, but this was not like a $50 million studio production. This was like a, barely greenlit, minimal budget. Actually, I think it was maybe $4 or $5 million budget. So Nomadland was her first studio production, and she did receive studio notes during the production. This was particularly true in the editing process, and she wove a roving story from footage that traversed the nation. She said, quote, "It was a mixture of stuff." These were about the notes she received. "It was a mixture of stuff about character, balance, tone, pacing. If you shoot unconventionally, as we did, you edit unconventionally, as we did, and it's helpful to remain grounded so you don't get too lost." So, I mean, that was an actual quote of hers. I found an interview about like, so it's a studio film. She's like, well, it was, but, there weren't producers on set. Like, she, McDormand, cinematographer, like they were all like living in vans as they were shooting this. Like they were doing it the way, in the style of the film they were creating, they were also living.
And to be clear, the writer didn't get into award season. This was her last movie, which was, I believe, totally indie, right?
Yeah. I mean, it ended up going out with Sony Pictures Classic, but the production company for that was like Highwayman Films. I think that's one of her outlet. Like it was them. They made it. Right.
So, part of it is like that could have ended up in the Academy Awards. I mean, it's not impossible. The assumption, part of it is like the Academy, it's not that it's not deeply weighted or that like seriously indie movies don't have trouble getting in there, because you do need studios pushing for you to get into the Academy Awards race. It isn't. There's a political economy to this, absolutely, but her Marvel contract, for instance, came out of The Rider. It didn't come out of this,
right? Because she was doing prep work on Eternals, like while shooting this. While editing this. So it was kind of a dual work for her there. Well, I mean, The Rider, there was some circles that, IndieWire, Deadline, there were some articles about like, ooh, is this going to maybe get some Oscars? Because it did end up winning Independent Spirit Award for Best Film and Best Director.
Oh, I thought it was gonna get a lot more attention. So I mean, I was sort of annoyed that it didn't. So like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that yes, this was like the next step up. This is not a sellout movie,
right? Oh, for sure, right. But because this was her indie movie. Nomadland was her indie movie that did break through, past the Independent Spirit Awards into the Oscars and then did win. But because it had the spotlight of like, oh, this, and also it's obviously 2020 is a weird fucking year for movies. So in that regard, once it became the front runner, it still had that back. I mean, obviously there was supporters, but there was that backlash to, oh, this movie's the front runner. And then, like you said, a lot of like Twitter criticism, which I shouldn't even say criticism next to that one, Twitter thoughts, Twitter opinions about it. Some of them that we were reading were like, did you even watch this movie?
No.
And they had not seen, her previous work.
So I actually, my mom has a friend, my whole family sort of in the left sphere, who literally just didn't watch the movie, but was perfectly willing to criticize it. But I guess, part of it is the examples that we have here. So that's the first layer. And I think we can say that that's not very good or useful. And it's not treating her as an artist. It's treating this, there's this abstraction called Hollywood. Now, Hollywood is a capitalist business. Like every other capitalist cultural industry, it has its own particular political economy. And so saying just Hollywood in the abstract, as if there's some sort of like decision-making body called Hollywood,
Right.
is super helpful when you're talking about an individual film. You're
Yeah.
talking about Hollywood culture or the industry as a whole, and especially how consolidated it is at this point. But between a few major conglomerates that are, there's not a will call Hollywood with one political vision.
Right.
And I think that what's interesting about the Oscars is that, the Oscars bear that out in their desperate attempt to stay relevant. So you can go from like a movie that's, I think, genuinely politically reprehensible, like Green Book, to
Sure.
a movie that's politically incredible, like Parasite, from year to year.
Yeah.
So what will is there in that?
Right.
That's it's a mess. I guess the next rung of criticism of this, there's a particular one that I think hits home, and then there's a broader one that might, and I want to talk it through.
Okay.
The one that hits home is that, so part of it is this. This is a movie in which the desolation caused by capitalist, basically crisis, is in a sense one of the catalysts, right? The death of her husband is the other. The destruction of the town is another. And she's becomes this nomad as part of seasonal labor. And we'll get into like what the view of the nomad is and what drives it. And I think this is where I disagree with, let's say, our Jackman article. Where I don't disagree is that they really soft pedal Amazon in what actually feels weird in our current moment, because Amazon is basically in some ways her most solid seasonal gig. And it is, Amazon, it is like she's a seasonal field worker or something like that. Like Amazon like basically makes sure that these, homeless nomads, I mean, not homeless, actually, they're houseless nomads, have somewhere to be nearby, and exploits them. They're basically senior labor. And, there's quotes from the book that the movie is based off of about what that's like. We all know what Amazon fulfillment centers are actually like at this point. There's been a long-term labor struggle, and the portrayal of them, every other job that she has, you can see how grueling it is. You see the unpleasantness of working at a campground and dealing with customers, and also the pleasures of just hanging out at a campground. You see what it's like working in a restaurant, as you're seeing these senior citizens working in a restaurant, and it's self-evident through the image. But when you're in the Amazon fulfillment center or the Amazon, in the warehouse, the first thing you see is a manager very carefully going through safety standards with them, and then them socializing with the manager in a friendly way during lunch breaks, which in reality, Amazon workers have trouble getting, it seems like, a lot of the time, let alone bathroom breaks, and the pace at which they're expected to work, and the level of isolation, right? Because Amazon warehouses are actually structured so that oftentimes workers don't actually associate with each other. Now, I'm not sure if this was true when this movie was set, but it is definitely true now, so that it is harder to organize internally. But it is the most positive work environment that she has. And I think the reason that's true is because they're shooting in an Amazon warehouse, and which means that Amazon has word on the cut. So I think that critique is valid. I think that part of that movie did not ring true to me.
I think that critique is potentially valid. And see, so I need to start off this part by just saying, fuck Amazon, all of that, right? I'm looking at a fictional representation in a fictional movie here. So I definitely have my ideas about Amazon. And in 2011, which is when this movie was set, it's focuses in on a thing that they still have going, which is called Amazon Camper Force. I was entirely unaware that this was even a thing until the movie, illustrated it, but it's still a thing. This Amazon Camper Force, it's program that brings like the RVers in for seasonal work, and I think you pointed out, Isaac, as we were just talking through the movie, the whole idea of like, it's repackaging like migrant labor.
Yeah.
Which it is. I kind of disagree with the way that it's being characterized as how it's portrayed in the movie, because I think there's a narrative element in this script, in this fictional story that they're telling, that you have to consider going into these Amazon scenes. And it's not like some of the critique of the Amazon stuff in different opinion articles or criticism, you'd think the whole thing was her working day to day in an Amazon factory. Like it's like 2 scenes, it's maybe 8 minutes of screen time total. Right. But let's focus on what you were talking about there, though. So you have the beginning of the movie, Fern, Frances McDormand's character, Fern, is she's in her like early 60s, I think. Lost her husband, literally lost her town. It was a company town, which we just talked about during like Molly McGuire's and How Green Is My Valley, some of our workers on film stuff we did in May, the idea of a company town. Holy shit, that still existed in 2011. It probably still exists right now. So you've got a loss of her husband, loss of her town, not through a natural disaster or anything, just because the sheetrock factory closed down, and that's what was employing everybody in this town. So like the opening title sequence says like this zip code doesn't exist anymore. So it's literally a ghost town. So you lose your home, your town, your spouse, your significant other, and then she makes the decision. She's like, well, I'm just going to live out of my van now. And so the Amazon scene, if it wasn't Amazon, it's just her first scene of like work and then interaction with other people. Work can be a form of community. It can be a form of camaraderie. And in this case, for Fern, this is her first time being around another group of people. And I think it's very telling narratively that you don't see her. She's not the one talking and interacting. She's not explaining herself or her lot in life or where she came from or what she's all about right now. It's other people passing on information to her. She's almost like this silent audience character just taking you through this scene.
So let's just talk about like what is her arc in this movie and how does that necessarily fit in? Because of course we do see her. Is this a story in which she's opening up to actually interact with people?
I think she slowly does, but sticking with just the first scene here with like the whole Amazon, like this seems to be the sticking point for some certain critics of like, well, this isn't how it works. This is not like they track you and they do this and this. And it's like, well, yeah, but also, and again, like fuck Amazon. I'm not a fan, whatever, but you could still work for Amazon and have an okay day at work.
Yes,
that's possible. One of the critiques was like, she's carrying a bin that has like the lightest box ever. And it was like, well, yeah, you're not always carrying a 700-pound box with the person behind you with a whip telling you to move faster. Like there are moments where like you can wave to an employee or you could say hi to someone or you stop to have lunch and you may meet someone new who you're like, oh, what are these tattoos? And like that can happen. I don't believe, but I don't have the actual evidence to back this up. I don't believe that there was like, you must show this cut of your film to Amazon and they sign off before an international corporation will release your movie to the masses.
Oh, I 100% think that I 100% think that they could not have filmed something that would have shown like the content of that book.
But also, I don't think. Well, that's what I was going to get to too. Was like the book. I feel like a lot of the leftist criticism I was reading of this movie was, well, in the book, blah blah blah. I was like, yeah, but this is not a page by page adaptation of this book. It's an inspirational guide to take to start off this movie. This is not a direct adaptation the way like, Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings was a direct adaptation.
I guess the question is, at a moment in which Amazon is, one of the most powerful companies in the world and certainly in the United States, and in which labor issues within the company are being deeply highlighted, would you ever do this in a movie involving, would you hold back in criticism on, let's say, a propaganda movie, like a cop propaganda movie?
Well, it's a good comparison. No, and I'm not saying that there isn't room for criticism about the way Amazon is portrayed in this movie. I feel like it's such an issue to certain critics, especially if you're, maybe more on the left side of the political spectrum in this particular country. And it hit my eyes and my brain weird watching it, where I was like, oh, wait, what's going on here? I don't think just because the movie doesn't address that heartless, evil corporation the way that I want it to makes it a bad movie, or that it's not doing just because it's not doing what I want it to do doesn't make it a bad movie.
So I don't think it makes it a bad movie. I actually think it does damage the movie, and I'll say why. Because this is a movie, and Chloé Zhao's style is based on deep realism.
Yeah.
And if you're watching something and it doesn't feel real, because there's very few actors in this movie. This is her first movie with actual actors, and there's like 2. There's 2 actors.
That's a good point that people really are kind of overlooking. Like, it's like, oh, they use all these non-professional actors. Like, no, that's her career so far. The weird part of this movie is that there's professional actors in it.
Yeah, that's the weird part. But here's the thing: is you watch a scene that just pulls you right out. That's a problem.
Okay, I'll give you that. It didn't pull me out of it when I was watching it. But it rang as like, because like there's personal baggage that you bring to this movie when you see the Amazon logo and the warehouse and everything. I think it's very telling, and I think an interesting production, an interesting aspect of the production, that the way Joshua James Rhodes, the cinematographer, films the Amazon warehouse, it to me looked very much like a mechanical process, the way he normally uses steady cams and handheld camera work to film things. This was very much just like, it felt like there was an actual rig. It was very mechanical way that the camera moved. It was very smooth. And it didn't have like the handheld vibe that the rest of the movie, including Other Jobs, have as well.
Is there any way to avoid political criticism when the first thing you see in an Amazon warehouse, in an Amazon, like, processing center or whatever, is a manager in a friendly manner giving safety tips when we have Amazon workers having to go to the hospital because they can't get bathroom breaks?
No, I'm with you on that. But see, it's interesting. So the way that scene rang to me, because I worked at a UPS packaging facility for a little bit in college, where I was packaging tractor trailers. That was my job. Like, it was coming down the conveyor belt, and I just had to like play Tetris for hours in the back of a truck. And we had those before each shift, and they were the fucking worst. And we were totally checked out. And we're just like, yeah, blah blah blah. It was just, that's the way that scene rang to me. It was not like, oh, they're concerned with safety. I was just like, oh God, one of these speeches from some we have to do this to cover our ass, blah, blah, blah scene.
And for all I know, they totally do that, right? Because it's just a standard thing you do anywhere where people have to do lifting. But the problem is that most people don't know that.
Sure.
And then you're seen socializing with the same manager afterwards. So the problem is that if you're dealing with Amazon, which is a major force in the film industry at this point.
Oh God, yeah. Goodbye, MGM.
And like, I think it is an unavoidable thing where like you can't stay neutral on a moving train. And the propaganda. I mean, basically, if it comes to labor rights, if it came to on, let's say, race and racism, we could say that a movie is still good. But at this point, it's still going to come for criticism if it dodges some of that stuff.
Yeah.
There's unfair criticisms that sometimes get thrown at movies because of like their context or when they're set, or just people like picking at things that are silly. But in a broader sense, if you were to ignore, I'm very uncomfortable with movies at this point that ignore racial context completely.
Right.
And I think part of it is in the Amazon scene, they're ignoring the labor context completely, which they don't do in the rest of the movie.
Right. No, I see what you mean. It does make me, because again, as we've been just chatting through this for a few minutes now, just this one scene, it does spark a conversation that either, I wish, Chloé or McDormand or anybody else involved with this movie is like, either, hey, let's just film at like a generic, like, some other like maybe just work in a field. Like, let's just do like harvesting as a seasonal job or something. Like, why did you keep the Amazon thread from the book?
I mean, part of it is the Amazon thread works really well because it fits with sort of, out of the wreckage of old industries, new ones, right? The problem is that you're going to have to actually deal with that. And I think let's move on to the rest of the movie, because there's other layers of criticism that flow out of this. And I'm not as attuned to them. I don't agree with them as much in terms of the quality of the movie. Sure. I think the Amazon scene actually detracts from the movie overall, like I said. But I think the rest of them doesn't detract from the quality. I'm a little more agnostic as to whether it's a political criticism that hits home. But let's talk about the other layers of criticism that go into the rest of the movie, which really has to do with her nomadism and why.
Right. Well, so as we go into that, I wanted to put forth a question to kind of consider as like an umbrella topic over the rest of this discussion. And that is with the passing of David Graeber earlier in the year, or was that late 2020? I forget when he passed away now. But I've been rereading some of his articles and some of his writing and listening to some of his interviews. And it really, I think, seems very apropos for this conversation, is just the concept of work within our society. And I think the emphasis placed on work rather than, as he would put it, like, play, or like just what it means to enjoy being a human alive. Like, work is a means to an end to, live in the capitalist society that we have. But most of the critics, the way that they talk about how work is represented in this movie is really, I think, almost like a Rorschach test for whoever's doing the criticism. If I didn't have to work to get by, I wouldn't. I would just watch movies and talk to you about movies and hit record every day. And that would be a great way to spend time. But that doesn't pay the bills, and there's bills to pay, and I got to keep the house and feed the family and all that other stuff. There's obligations there. But the idea of work, I kind of want to just keep in the back of our minds as we talk through this, because I think you see how people that are criticizing or writing criticism, not necessarily criticizing, but writing criticisms or reviews of this movie. I think this movie works as a Rorschach test to kind of look at, like, oh, that's interesting that's how you look at work. As we go through, because I think the film is saying some very interesting things about work through the Fern character.
So what do you go further with that? Like, what do you think they are saying?
Well, okay, so I pulled a few quotes from different articles. There was one that really triggered this that I thought was interesting, that was in the New Yorker. What was this one called? This was called Chloé Zhao's nostalgic portrait of itinerant. I don't know how to pronounce that word. Sorry. Itinerant America. The movie is set in 2011, 2012 against the backdrop of the 2008 financial crisis, but it neglects the basics of nomads' life. How do they vote? Where do they pay taxes? Where do they bank? I was like, well, it's not about that. It's not about that. And I was like, but their negative, their kind of negative critique of this movie was like, you're missing the basics. How do you do this? How do you do that? And I was like, well, that's not what this movie's about at all.
Right.
Which I thought was kind of telling from actually, I don't know if that was actually a review or just more of like an opinion piece, because there's so many fucking opinion pieces about this movie, which is great. I'm glad that it's getting out there and it's getting a discussion going. Obviously, it's got us to do a whole episode about it.
I mean, I think part of what's interesting, so she has an arc involving nomadism and her enjoyment of it, but also the loneliness of it. Like, part of what's interesting about it is, this is something like the Jacobin article, I think it's stripped up. Like, everybody's like, it's romantic, it's a good thing. They're portraying it as a good thing or bad thing. Like, I don't think they're portraying it as either, right? Like, it's more complicated than that. Her relationship to this,
yes,
it's both good and bad. It's both what she wants and something that she, in a sense, has trouble living with as well. She both rejects human relations and then eventually gets into them, and yet contradictorily can't maintain them or can't reproduce what she did with her husband, right? She can't build something that deep again after so much loss. And at the end of the movie, spoilers, she comes to terms with the loss of her husband and to a certain degree the loss of the town. And that's actually part of the arc, is grieving, which one of the things about the nomads in general is what you realize is, like, I mean, the guy, I can't remember his name, who's sort of like the guru for who's sort of teaching people how to nomad, do stuff. He does this online. He's a real person.
Oh, Bob Wells.
Yeah, he openly talks about this being based on starting with this because of economic displacement, and trying to teach people and help people to live in a world in which that's happening and to adapt to those conditions.
Right.
And Fern is technically a victim of that, but her upfront issues, right? Like, she definitely economically struggles because she needs money. But she actually has a safety net, both through the friends that she makes along the way, who are probably, one of whom like actually offers her a place to live, or from her upper middle class relatives. And that is a choice, because what it means ultimately is that because she has a bit of a safety net there, we refocus onto the interpersonal as opposed to the economic strivings.
Right.
And that is actually a choice. Now, I don't think it's necessarily an invalid choice, and I don't think it takes away from the quality of the film at all.
No.
Necessarily. But it is ultimately, and as the premise of our podcast would say, it is a political choice.
It is, but I think in this case too, it's also an interesting narrative choice, because this character Fern is looking for a few things, which is why I think it's another amazing kind of humanist portrayal by Chloé and her team. of there is a safety net, granted, so that's there, so that is a thing. But Fern is personally choosing to process grief over the loss of, as we said, like her partner for decades and decades, but also any sense of home or location based feeling of belonging, with kind of a personal journey to heal or at least process grief. But then also she says several times in the movie that like this was something she felt that she wanted to do personally, to kind of like to hit the road, to be out and see the world, to feel a bit more connected, in this particular case with like within the natural world as well. So that as a healing process for her as well, but also as an exploratory process, and then seeking new forms of community. Like you said, she doesn't do that right away, but as she's exposed to Bob Wells and the Rubber Tramp Rendezvous, and she sees that there's other people out there living this life, and then seeing what their motivations were for being, van dwellers, for being nomads, gives her a sense of belonging through a shared experience, even if you're not all sharing the experience at the same time. Like they're around the rendezvous together, but there's also a lot of solo time as well out there, but feeling connected because, okay, I'm not just this crazy person like living in my van. Like this is a choice I'm making, and this is steps along the healing process for her.
Yeah.
So it's complicated because there's like all these little shades going on, but it's also, it doesn't feel overtly like a preaching kind of movie. It's all just sort of there. And I think that's why it's such an amazing work of humanist and naturalist filmmaking. Not quite like neorealism style, but in a way there are scenes of that. And it goes down so easy because it's all kind of, to me, it felt my first instinct when the credits hit the first time I watched it, I was like, man, this might be like one of like, this is like a top 10 road movie films for me. Because it hits on all of those beats that a great road movie does.
It does. I guess part of it is that I think that's all totally true. But I think with the premise of this show, I can also make the political critique of the choice.
No, that's valid. And I think it's there.
I think, of the choice. And, there was one of the tweets. Oh, what was it? It's like, this is a movie about settler colonial privilege, which really annoyed the hell out of me. Not because it's not true. But well, no, it's true. But almost every American movie that is not about indigenous people is actually almost every single one.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
In a certain sense. But here's where it gets complicated, is that, in a lot of ways, Chloé Zhao's films have always focused all three of her films, two of them set on reservations, shot on reservations with indigenous non-actors, dealing with literally things that probably happened in all of their lives. But basically, her arena is the West.
Mm-hmm.
Is the West, which is the place where the imaginary of settler colonialism in the United States sort of lives, right? Like where we fight these things out. And there are points in this movie where, like her sister, for instance, basically openly, invokes the history of sort of American, in a sense, American settler colonialism, the ability to move around, and invokes Fern's choices as part of that tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Because by that point, Fern has a choice. At the beginning of the movie, Fern doesn't really have a choice. I mean, she always had choices, actually. Her safety net is her old neighbors. There's people who would take her in, right? And she doesn't want to do that for very understandable reasons. She always had some other economic choices than being a nomad, but that wasn't what was going to do what she needed to do.
Right.
We've talked about for good reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually don't think the settler colonial read on it actually makes a lot of, I think it totally misses other forms of capitalist relations, right? Because part of it is that what they end up being is an exploitable labor force for Amazon or other businesses along the way. They're the flotsam and jetsam of capitalist, like what's called like creative destruction in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another movie which I want to cover as part of a pairing that actually gets into this dynamic and directly addresses settler colonialism, and that's Hell or High Water. They directly talk about cattle ranching being displaced by, the fracking boom.
Oh,
and
right.
The original settlers of the land who displaced indigenous populations are now being displaced by capitalism in itself. Fern is part of that process as well. and her whole community is part of literally the process being described in Hell or High Water. But the focus ultimately is put onto not just her personal journey, but like the people closest to her are not the people who are displaced economically. So Bob, what was it, Bob Wells?
Yeah.
He may or may not be displaced economically, but the way it's introduced to us is that in some ways he's processing the death of his son. Her other friend is dealing with the fact that she's dying of cancer. And then, Strathern's character, I can't really remember why he's doing exactly what he's doing, but he's sort of running away from family. He has somewhere to go. So everybody, you actually don't deal with any of the economic refugees, even though they exist. Every character has something else haunting them.
Right.
And once again, I think it makes for a really beautiful and great movie that does touch on sort of humanistic themes, but it's a political choice to do that. And there's I think a valid political critique by making that choice, because it means that it's really not, it's about a thin layer of the American experience, but it's not really about the fallout of 2008 anymore once you do that.
True. But it also, I think that's that it keeps coming back in my head, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to articulate this really well, but that this idea of work defining a person rather than it being about your personal experience as a human being while you're here on Earth, and seeking some compassion, maybe processing, grief and trauma, but also an intentionally well-lived life where you are making your own decisions and you're doing what you want to do. Because all the descriptions that we have right here so far within the narrative of this film is like, oh God, that's such a downer. Oh God, that's tragic too. Oh, that's awful too. But this isn't, to me, never felt like a downer kind of film. Yes, there are certain elements of it where like, oh my God, that's so tragic. That's so sad. But then like her friend, the character that she's around who is dying of cancer, who mentions that to her, who tells her how she wants to go out. It's not in a hospital bed hooked up to machines, hopefully trying to have a few more minutes of life left. She wants to be out in the world. She even has a specific spot on a river that she wants to go and experience that one more time before she's done in this world.
Right.
Like it's there are choices, there are safety nets to certain characters, but they're not, hang on. Like I have a couple of quotes I pulled from articles that kind of speak to this. The idea, romanticizing the existence of senior citizens roaming America's highways and byways, seeking work and free parking. Nomadland soft pedals the nightmare that is the gig economy. That's the focus on work. I don't feel like that's the focus
of the movie.
So
like,
I think, you know what I mean?
Part of it is that there's the romanticized element that actually exists with the freedom that they find there. But they're all, that's the critique that I think totally fucking misses the point. They're all actually dealing with the incredible difficulties of life, including the difficulties of aging. Like the difficulties of aging are like very much on display. The sense of, part of what's amazing about the movie is that it's a world of older people.
Right. Well, you do not get that in Hollywood.
Right. There's like 1, 2 young characters, 3, but they're just side characters. You don't do that in Hollywood. You're absolutely right. And that is an incredible strength of the movie. And they deal with the economic precarity because of the work that they have to do, but it is not the focus. That is my actual political critique, in the sense that is a political choice, and it doesn't make the movie worse, unlike I think the Amazon bit, but it is something that you politically note as a choice. But I think critiques like that totally miss the point of what's happening, because it's actually kind of, it's much more subtle and complicated in how it treats these things. It's not simply just romanticizing. That's the weak read. That's the bad left read to me.
Well, it is, because and it's not even just specifically the left, because there's a Armond White quote I want to do a little bit in a moment from the National Review, but there were so many of these reviews that just so focused on the work that she was able to find within the movie. And from Fern's character's point of view too, the work she's finding is just a means to an end, as is pretty much everybody's work, I guess. And it was either a focus on like the work that she was doing, or the like, oh my God, she had a shit in a bucket. I'm like, well, this isn't the Grapes of Wrath or something. Like, this is a person who she could have the whole time. This movie could have been 5 minutes long. She loses her husband, loses the house, loses the town, moves in with her sister or sister-in-law, or whoever that was, and that
or her neighbor who first died.
Yeah. was like, it was a choice. Granted, there's a whole safety net thing. We already discussed that. We got that out of the way. But like, it was a conscious choice on Fern's part to go like, you know what? I thought about this. I wanted to do this. I'm doing this. I'm gonna do it this way.
Isn't that part of the problem of the hype of the movie? Because this is sold as a real reality of the difficulties of modern American life, in a sense.
Right.
And the book that it's based on is that. So part of the problem is that the way that sort of like the awards buzz functioned.
Mm-hmm.
If that's what if you're reacting off of that and not the text of the film, you're going to have those problems because, yes, honestly, like working at the campground is shitty. You can see, I think that the other labor things, it's not focused on those, but they're not portrayed romantically, actually. They're not portrayed as easy. They're portrayed as struggles.
Right. They're like little like pains in the ass she has to do because like the van needs fixed or she needs a little bit more money. So she'll grab, like the bulk of the movie is not like, what's the next job? It's more just like, it's more her experience. And
Right.
on occasion that involves a job.
Yes. See, that's the problem is they are focusing on the wrong thing. Maybe that life isn't based on the job that you're doing or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That's a particular vantage point on that life, and I suspect it's actually not as accurate as it could be, but whatever. But yeah, yeah, they're missing the point of the movie, but I think part of it is they're not watching the movie. They're
Right.
basing off of the hype around the movie.
Well, this is what I meant about that kind of that Rorschach test element. Like there was a, I think it was an actual review, not an opinion piece in the Atlantic that said this, it called it a dreary semi-documentary about elderly people forced to live in vans and yes, perform unspeakable bodily functions within them and search for seasonal work. Like, yeah, that is in the movie, but like the fact that you're so focused on that says more about you than the movie.
Yeah.
In my opinion, but
I guess I'm saying it says more about the person, but it also says more about the hype around what the movie is supposed to be.
Well, and then that too, which I mean, I'm not going to say we should entirely dismiss it. I think movie marketing is probably like a thread we should be addressing. And I think we have been addressing throughout the life of the show, but maybe its own standalone episode at some time. But this was Searchlight Pictures after the Fox Disney merger. So this was being put out by, it's technically called Searchlight Pictures now, but Fox Searchlight, a big, huge player in the art house film world. I don't know how much control a director has over marketing and how the film is,
marketed and
marketed.
so on.
But yeah, like I heard Chloe's out new movie. That's all I needed to know. I'm there. I'm rewatching it.
And the same. I'm really looking forward to Eternals. That was the.
God, why did I just say that? I'm actually not looking forward to that one.
But part of it is I guess all the movies from the 60s and 70s that we love so much because the politics are baked in.
Yeah.
This shows that we're not at that moment yet.
No.
Because this is what you do. You couldn't do, in a sense, Easy Rider cannot escape the politics of the 60s. It's about the cultural politics of the 60s.
Yeah.
In a way that this movie is not. And I think that is part of the deeper critique, which doesn't touch the quality of it and doesn't touch its humanist themes, but maybe speaks to the limitations of those themes. Ultimate limitations of those themes.
I don't know if it's a limitation of the themes or it's a limitation of the people that are interpreting those themes.
Yeah.
When they're critiquing the film.
I'm turning on the movie a little bit. My example of the 60s and 70s films is that in a period in which we are actually in major political unrest.
Mm-hmm.
So many movies, by intention or not, could not escape. And a movie that is dealing so deeply with things that are actually about this moment that we've been living through since 2008, to sort of focus on these sort of humanistic things that, in a sense, abstract from the context of 2008.
Okay.
It, like I've been saying, is a political choice, and it's one that, once again, doesn't detract from the technical quality of the film, but is open to critique. I think where a lot of these fall down is they're not very good at reading movies. So what they'll end up doing is they're romanticizing the travel or they're romanticizing the work, which is like not what's happening in the movie.
Or even
Like,
not romanticizing, they're obsessed with like the work that's being portrayed.
they're obsessed with the work that's being portrayed, but like I mean, that's sort of part of it. Is the reason they're obsessing about that is because it's weird to not have that more of a focus, or weird to not have that be at the center of things in a movie that's built around the effects of the 2008 crash.
I get it, yeah.
But I think where they more often than not screw up is actually reading her journey. So because they're so obsessed with what they want to see in the movie, they don't see what the movie is actually doing.
Yes.
And I think that that's a mistake in reviewing a film. But then you can still come around, which is basically what I'm doing, and saying, well, okay, this is what you're doing. It's very impressive. But what are the limitations of that in this moment? In 2021, 13 years after 2008, in which we are living in another major economic crisis, in which we never got out of the effects of the previous one, and you're doing a movie that's based off of, the devastation wrought by that, and yet, in a sense, you're dodging the devastation to do with that, to deal with sort of broader humanistic universal themes of loss.
I would have said like personal themes of loss, because it stays with one character as they're traversing this environment.
Mourning off of loss of place, which admittedly that is
loss.
And personal loss. She ends up talking more openly about the personal loss than the loss of place. But the loss of place is the 2008 knockoff, and that's there.
Well, her loss of place too is like the home, the city, but then also the physical dwelling that she was in with her husband, which she goes back to. So I don't think she articulates it, in dialogue in that particular case. But the fact that she goes back and revisits
it's the language
ghost town. It's right.
It's totally in the language of the film.
Yeah.
And that is actually reckoning with the effects of 2008. So I'm going to concede that. And I think that's definitely there. Everyone else who's a nomad, none of them are actually dealing with the fallout of it. And so when I say broader humanistic sort of concern,
it's hinted at, I think it's not hinted at, but like there is some text when they're sitting around the campfire at the first rubber tramp rendezvous that she's at, like early on in the film, they're mentioning like set to retire, but then HR calls and like, oh, your healthcare is gone, or we're not doing, like there is a whole reverberations of what happened.
It's just that like the characters that we get to know, the broader humanistic concerns, what I mean by that is cancer and sickness, the inevitability of death, the loss of a husband, the loss of a child, the things that drive you off to drift and detach from society to find yourself in a different way.
Right.
These are broader universal themes, quote unquote, but are actually abstracted from the specificity of the moment that the movie is set in.
Yeah.
And I think that that's actually kind of a weird choice in retrospect.
Maybe it's just one of those like weird fine line things, because it's clearly a single character's journey and arc.
Right.
But there is the backdrop of this larger thing, which isn't maybe brought into full focus within the dialogue or the visuals or the narrative, because like, life's messy. Like there isn't a full focus. Like the like Fran's journey isn't to realize, oh, I got fucked over by this whole capitalist society. Like that's not a thing that this movie is doing.
Well, part of it is, and I agree with that. And there's a lot of movies that set themselves in a particular historical context, and then like that's just the historical context. You don't deal with the fullness of it, and you don't have to. It enriches, right?
Right.
And I think that's a totally valid choice in terms of filmmaking, and it can enrich. And I think in this context, it like I said, and I've said this repeatedly, I don't think it takes away from the filmmaking. I don't think it actually takes away from the film or the themes per se.
Right.
But but that as a choice is open to critique.
Sure.
And it is, in a sense, does ring a little bit weird in the political moment that we're in.
Yeah.
That you have an opportunity to do one thing and you do another. Doing that is a perfectly valid film.
Right.
And I think for everybody who's sort of like outside of the Amazon bit is saying that this is romanticizing this or this or this, like, no, you're missing the point.
Right.
But I think when it's put in its wider context, it becomes a weirdly depoliticized film that deals with political themes. And that's in another context, I'd actually really enjoyed that in a film, and I think at this one, it perplexes me mildly, or wonders what the conversations behind the scenes were.
Yeah.
Among the filmmakers to make those decisions.
Well, I think it just hits so close to home with certain themes that you like or I like or you'd want to see explored more, but I'm erring more on the side of the filmmaker and the artist involved in this, and like, but was that what they were trying to do here? Is that the central focus of what they're trying to do here?
So what I'm saying is I get that part.
Right.
And I'm not trying to put something on them, but I am perfectly willing to challenge them for making the choices that they did.
For sure. And I think that's very valid. And it could be a fact of just like, maybe that particular artist wasn't aware of that interpretation coming their way because of how they were presenting something.
Yeah.
Like there could be a naivete involved here as well. I don't know.
What do you know about the politics of Chloé Zhao? She has some difficulties, right? I mean,
so I'm actually not sure, but that is actually a beautiful transition to a couple of quotes I pulled from Armond White's review of this movie in the National Review, because he has some opinions.
He certainly does, writing for the National Review.
So Armond White, well, I don't want to get into a whole thing with him. Like I didn't know some of his stuff was being published in the National Review, although that didn't really surprise me. But when his critiques pop up, as I'm on Metacritic or Rotten Tomatoes often, I will click on it because he is he's an interesting guy who I don't agree with, obviously, but find his reviews to usually either be infuriating or get me thinking or get me pacing or get me yelling at my phone or whatever. So he's not at that Pauline Kael level. Like we mentioned in the 60s episodes. Again, we have not gone an episode without plugging our summer 60s episodes from last year, summer 2020. Pauline Kael, stellar writer. I love her critiques. I rarely agree with her. Armond White, mostly a douchebag in my book, but I can't stop reading his reviews because of, I don't know. So here's an example. Nomadland's protagonist, Fern, played by Frances McDormand, is a white Nevadan widow who, after losing employment when a local sheetrock plant shuts down, wanders the back roads of gig economy America in her RV. That's just basic synopsis of the film. Again, focus on the work and as if this movie is a critique of the gig economy, which I don't think it is.
So could I just one sec? I don't want to knock you totally off here.
That's fine.
I'm really getting annoyed with how gig economy is being deployed here.
I'm with you there.
I mean, if we mean it in terms of sort of like these are migrant workers. Like the gig economy is a new concept, probably shouldn't be, frankly, because it's actually closer to the historical norm of actually the sheer level of precarity under capitalism.
Right.
But if we're talking about it in terms of like tech platforms, it literally has nothing to do with this movie. It's literally just short-term migrant work.
Right.
So I think really what we should be saying, instead of gig economy, you should be saying the precarity of fucking modern capitalism in America.
Yes.
And, yes.
But gig economy sounds hipper and cooler, and it takes some of the sting out of what it's really about.
Yeah, well, and it's supposed to be treating something new that's not new, or a reformulated version of something that's old. I mean, part of what's amazing. Yeah, I mean, part of what's amazing about something like, Uber is they really are just repackaging things that have historically been done before. It is just a way of devaluing people's labor through an app as opposed to other means historically, which is why, Silicon Valley's full of shit because they can't come up with anything really new. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you going.
No, that's perfectly legit, because like it has that thing of like you're a high schooler and you're in a band, you're like, I got a gig, and like it's exciting, like it's using a word that like, no, that's not what this is. I just thought like his but I just wanted to use that as an intro for him, because like it's another example of like this obsession over like what is the work they're doing in this movie, and it's like, oh my god, like you're missing like the human value of this movie. So this quote, we'll get to some of, like, I don't know, this quote is a mixed bag, so get ready to get angry, I think, here, Isaac. Quote, this is about Frances McDormand's character. Quote, her bobbed hair looks monastic, as if rejecting sexual attraction, doing penance as she takes us on a tour of American devastation. She's just an embodiment of the political self-righteousness of Beijing-born Zhao.
Wow, okay, so a little bit of
racist there, right?
A little bit of racist dog whistle.
Yeah.
Actually. And part of his, I read part of his review. I did not read the whole thing, and I admit that.
It's a gem.
I'll only judge it on what I read. And part of what's amazing is he has the opposite political read because he's writing for the National Review, in which this is like a liberal screed for bringing up that anything is possibly wrong and that this movie shows any images of economic devastation, because certainly that's not what's happened. And I realize I'm not being totally fair to him even there, but like,
fuck it.
I mean, part of it is, yeah, but it's bullshit, right? Like, it's total bullshit. It's like, it's like sort of the right wing sort of like talking points on COVID, where if we just ignore it, it'll go away. If we just toughen up.
Yeah.
So part of what's really wild about that is that he uses Vagabond by Agnes Varda to go after this.
Oh, that's right. He does. I didn't pull any of those quotes, but yeah, it's a review that's a comparison of Vagabond versus Nomadland.
Which admittedly, Vagabond, I think, is to a certain degree about sort of like looking at the personalized freedom that came out of the 60s and sort of critiquing its ultimate results. But it's Agnes Varda. She doesn't ignore structural factors at all, especially patriarchy and economic ones as well throughout the film. And this is a woman who's made incredibly political films at earlier stages in her career. So the idea of invoking... Basically, the idea of invoking Agnes Varda as your sort of image of like right-wing libertarian like responsibility, individualizing responsibility politics is a wild thing to do to me.
What's also makes me wonder, like, did you miss the point on any of Varda's films, specifically in Vagabond? But like, what?
I mean, I think it's that he's not totally off on Vagabond, but like also he's not right at all.
right.
But like,
it's a little confusing, but also like the way that we were just mentioning, like he uses the phrase gig economy, which, you know, we were kind of analyzing it from a different point of view. Like that's actually not the right word you should be using here, but he is into semantics because he has a different part where he's talking about how like he was really upset that she used the phrase, like an actual quote from the movie was, "Oh, I'm not homeless, I'm houseless." And he's like, "Oh God, the libs again with like the semantics." I'm like, that's a thing though.
There's a reason. I mean, part of it is, one can roll your eyes at that on occasion, but in this case, it's literally the case because a lot of the movie is about turning her RV into a home, and an RV is not a house,
right? But it can be a home.
Right?
So, but then also the whole idea of like what her bobbed hair looks monastic, as if rejecting sexual attraction. It was like, first of all, there is a romantic sexual attraction plot in this movie with her and David Strathairn, but also like, I don't feel like that's a valid critique of the movie.
Is it a critique? Is there anything wrong with, I don't understand. I mean, there's very clear,
like she's mourning the loss of a partner she's had for decades, her husband.
Right. There's very good reasons why she's not interested in relationships.
Right. Like it's kind of specific. And I think you're missing the point if you're like, oh, she's just rejecting sexuality and sexual I'm like, well, maybe that's also just not the first thing on her mind as a 60-year-old woman who just lost her spouse.
Right. And
I don't know. You know, biologically, maybe sex isn't, you know, driving every decision she makes at that particular age. I don't know.
Or romantic companionship or whatever. I mean, like part of it is, I mean, she's not like even that great at being friends. She makes more friends and she does do that. But like, it actually takes some work for her to get to that point outside of people that she already knew.
Almost
because
like she's been traumatized recently and is having trouble connecting with people.
It's almost as if Armond is doing what a lot of the left-wing critics did, which is like not read the text of the film.
Right.
Which is interpretable, but like does actually exist.
Well, so the last quote I pulled from him is this one. He says, quote, "This passive-aggressive sanctimony has become the driving force of crusading filmmakers such as Zhao. Nomadland is part of the current glut of political correct anti-entertainment."
Whatever.
Yeah, that was when I read that. I was just like, I threw my hands up. I was like, we what? And then I immediately copy and pasted it into the doc for this episode because I was like, I'm not even sure what to do with that statement.
Well, part of it is this: all the discourse on Twitter, the pressure that a movie that like this comes under, is ultimately in a lot of ways a good thing. Because it's speaking to political wins. It's contradictory because sometimes it's bullshit, but it's speaking to, at least within the cultural sphere, the rise of a new left that has filtered some of its politics into like the broader liberal sphere and actually sharpened their critiques as well. And that's good in a broad sense, and he's reacting to that. He thinks that we're in a glut of political films. I think both of us would agree that that's not the case.
Not the case.
Except to a certain degree in sort of reaction to BLM, which I think there's a lot more work that deals with that in recent years, and incredible movies, some of the best movies that have come out in the last 5 or so years. Like that's good. But, in the sense, but like, I think he is reacting to a cultural sphere that if you're on the right, you're losing.
Oh, I see what you mean. I hadn't thought about it that way. Okay, yeah. No, that's a very positive and accurate take on that, I think.
Right. Because even, I think the lefty critique of this movie would sort of point toward its soft pedaling centrism. But on the right, like, I think I was saying, like any acknowledgement that something is wrong.
Right. Oh, God. Yeah. See the whole bullshit critical race theory debate that Fox News keeps fueling right now.
Well, I mean, critical race theory is a specific academic, like, here's a specific discipline, but what they're really going after is, this is a backlash against the power of of the BLM uprisings to sort of like actually force reckoning and structural transformation in terms of race. And they don't want to do that. And this is a way for them to try to counter that and make sure that your kids never learn anything about this, that race even exists, which means that racism flourishes because we don't actually, if you act like it doesn't exist, then yeah.
Well, we live in the greatest country of all time ever, period, end of story. Why do we need to look backwards? Come on.
I mean, when we're basically open white nationalists at this point, I mean, part of it is it's a reaction to them losing on a lot of fronts, and they want to win, and they can do a lot of damage this way. And of course, also it's as well as sort of like the shock politics where like on the edge of conspiratorialism that like from like the attack on Christmas onward, right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's a great way to mobilize because nobody knows what this is, so it can be anything.
Yeah, it can be whatever you want to. There was actually, and I think this is probably a good point to wrap up on. I'd mentioned being, a fan of Chloé Zhao's previous work, so I was like, oh, she's got a new movie. It's Nomadland. It's ended up going to be on a streaming service for me to watch. That sucks. I'd rather have it on the big screen or whatever. So I didn't really know too much about it, but I did catch on a podcast or maybe something I was reading. Frances McDormand. Before I saw the movie, the only thing I knew about it was that it was, called Nomadland. I'd heard it was about van dwellers. Frances McDormand, couldn't wait. And then I'd heard Frances McDormand interview, or I read a quote or something about how she had said, because she's her partner, her husband is Joel Coen of the Coen brothers. And there was this anecdote. So this is what I knew going into the movie. So I think this maybe also kind of colored my perception as I went through the narrative the first time. She had said, she told her husband when they were in their 40s, she had told her husband, quote, "When I'm 65, I'm changing my name to Fern. I'm smoking Lucky Strikes, drinking Wild Turkey. I'm getting an RV and I'm hitting the road." And then McDormand said, after reading Bruder, who wrote the book that inspired the movie, I don't want to say it was based on, but inspired the movie. When she read Bruder's book, that was when she'd read the book, but then also had seen The Rider pretty close together, Chloé Zhao's previous film. And then she really was touched by the way that, Chloe's like, production style and The Rider looked. She was like, oh my God, this is like the perfect vision to bring this story to life. So I went into it thinking it was a combination of like the book and Frances McDormand, obviously being able to like get a movie made, having some power behind the scenes, as a producer as well, but also as the star of it. So I didn't go into it thinking like this is a faithful adaptation of a book. This was more of like an idea that McDormand had as an actor and producer she could bring to reality. Oh, this book kind of feeds into this. Oh, the vision of Chloé Zhao and her team and the way they've done Songs My Brother Told Me, and then also the Rider. This all came together here. So I think I was a little bit more tempered going into it with the first viewing of this is not an adaptation of this book that is a scathing critique of, a surviving America in the 21st century. So I think that maybe colored my first viewing of the movie because the Amazon scenes didn't hit me as like, what the fuck? This isn't the scathing critique of Amazon that we need to have right now. It was more just, I was willing to go with it and, follow Fern on her journey throughout this particular narrative.
But wouldn't the critique then be that, in a sense, Frances McDormand watered it down to deal with a pre-existing set of ideas?
It could be, but again, I don't know that I have evidence that that was the case. I don't have evidence that some Amazon CEO or Jeff Bezos was in a screening room saying, cut that. No, you can't do that. Here, change the script or any of that sort of stuff.
I'm talking about the entirety of the narrative. I'm talking about sort of the humanism versus this sort of cold economic reality, the fact that you're primarily not dealing with economic refugees, but people who are like making choices like, frankly, what Frances McDormand is talking about.
Right.
So what that ends up being is you focus on an aspect of that community over other ones.
Yeah.
And once again, can create perfectly valid art through that, but also worth noting that that is what you did, and that there are political consequences to that. Primarily think pieces on Twitter, but also in the effect on the art itself.
Yeah.
Once again, great movie, really beautiful.
Yep.
Gets across a powerful message. Lots of things. In a sense, we didn't even do it justice by having this conversation around it. But I think by the nature of our podcast, we always have to have that critique.
Yeah, I think so too.
We always have to be willing to say like, Nomadland's great. This is the, whatever. But not give in to the temptation to say that makes it a bad movie, because then, what's the point of enjoying art? And me, I love the contradiction. I love the contradiction between a movie whose form is beautiful and powerful and gives a powerful message, and me also getting pissed off at it politically.
Right. I think that's where this one really hit a clear nerve culturally as well, where I think the artistry and crafts and the craft that's on display on the screen in this movie is inarguable, but some of the ins and outs of political critiques of this movie are valid to a certain extent, but also I feel like some people ended up veering off into territory of, it's not the decisions I would have made, so I need to really take this movie to task.
Right.
So, fine. But I think in this case, the artistry far outweighs what potentially could have been done politically with the film. And I think maybe would have felt potentially shoehorned in, because that's not the character's point of view that we're following. I mean, it's a singular character we're following through this entire arc.
Well, I think part of the problem is you would have had to make a different movie.
Right.
And in this case, what I'm saying is, more often than not, when that particular critique is made, I'm not sympathetic to it. In this particular case, I guess I'm saying that this was a good movie. Maybe a different movie should have made if this is the sandbox you're playing in.
Yeah. Well, that is Nomadland, the Oscar-winning film from Chloé Zhao and company from 2020. Frances McDormand, longtime cinematographer, Joshua James Richards, and folks, streaming currently, I guess, on Hulu. Although the Blu-ray is out, so just get the physical media. Don't support Hulu. Just own the movie. We may or may not be back with comments on the Eternals when that comes out. I assume we will be.
Here's the thing. I mean, me, I'm interested in Eternals because it's the most Kirby-esque of all, and that's Jack Kirby. The Eternals were characters purely created by him, not with Stan Lee, and in the 70s, and they're weird as hell. And so in terms of pop culture, it's an interesting choice, and it's an interesting choice to put her on it.
Which is why I'm interested.
That's fair.
So she's working with Ben Davis, a cinematographer. So I guess that's what the Marvel machine will do to you. It'll split up a fantastic working relationship over 3 feature films. But she is doing the screenplay, or she is co-writing the screenplay, and I don't think she's editing. But we do have her first, LGBTQ superhero depiction. Finally, Marvel. Took you fucking long enough. And it is Paul Thomas Anderson's longtime editor. So there's reasons for me to be excited about a Marvel property. Fine, I said it. It's on wax.
And you call it a property, which is
it's what it is.
Nice little side cut. Well, but what I'm this is true with all the blockbusters. Hey, segue, is that there's always an artistic element to them, and along with them being quote product, and that's also part of what's interesting. What are we going to be doing next?
Well, you said segue, so it seemed like you were primed there. But we decided, since it's summertime, as we were recording this, it is the beginning of June, and on top of that, fingers fucking crossed, movie theaters are seeing a bit of people returning, including us. We just finally went and met up in person and saw a movie on the big screen.
Wild.
And it was pretty wild. We thought, hey, it's summertime, a resurgence of the movie theater experience. The lineup this summer in America at the North American box office is just blockbuster after blockbuster that were on hold for the better part of a year due to pandemic. So we thought, you know what? Let's take a look at the history and politics of the blockbusters. So I think our plan is to go through a few decades, because the blockbusters have not been around since the start of film. That is their origin story, as it were, to use comic book terms, was in the 70s. So our first stop on a tour of the history and politics of blockbusters is going to be the 1970s up next for us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And this is very exciting. We get to pick and choose our favorites over the decades. And
yeah, I get the feeling this isn't necessarily going to be like full deep dives on certain titles, but more of a general conversation with a few titles in every episode, because there's a lot to cover there. And there's I'm guessing with the premise of the show that I'm watching these films that I've seen, most of them seen previously, with very different eyes now.
I mean, if you think that I'm not going to do a deep dive on Independence Day, you've got another thing.
Oh, I'm with you on that. I'll stand by Roland Emmerich, even his garbage movies are worth a watch. But tune in for future episodes to see what we're saying about the history and politics of the blockbuster films, specifically the North American box office. So that is up next for us on the show. But before we sign off, we always want to remind you politely to rate and review the show if you're enjoying it in whatever podcast app you are using. That helps get the word out and get the algorithms moving in our favor. If you do enjoy the show, also, you could just tell a friend or two about it. If we're striking a chord with you as far as film criticism goes, we're up and running on all the usual social media accounts. Just check the show notes for all of those links. Posting things that have to do with the show and some stuff outside the show that we're just watching. So give us a like and a follow there if you're so inclined. And until next time, I am Aaron.
And I'm Isaac. And, stay safe out there. Be careful, because here's the thing. It's the summer. It's blockbuster season. If anybody's seen Maximum Overdrive, you know that there's always a possibility that your lawnmower will come alive and try to eat you. And some people might call me paranoid, but, I just feel like be prepared.